They've run Scotland for 17 years and taken the nation to the brink of independence from the UK. But now, amidst a police investigation, deleted WhatsApps and new leadership, the SNP are under huge political pressure from Labour. To discuss that and more, we are in Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city and a place that ran deep Labour red for almost a century before the SNP became the dominant power. So plenty to debate with our audience here, which reflects the electoral picture across the nation here in Scotland. Welcome to Question Time. From the SNP, Kate Forbes. In 2020, she was made Scotland's Finance Secretary at the age of just 29. Last year, she came very close to being her new party leader and First Minister, losing narrowly to Humza Yousaf. She then rejected a cabinet post and resides on the backbenches. If she had become leader, she says she'd have ended her party's government cooperation deal with the Greens. Patrick Harvie is one of two Scottish Green ministers in that SNP Green power-sharing government. His ambition is for an independent Scottish Republic. Due to disagreements over taxation and same-sex marriage, he says he'd have quit his ministerial role had Kate Forbes become First Minister. From the Conservatives, Malcolm Offord grew up in a tenement flat just 25 miles from here and is now a minister in the UK Scotland office and the Department of Business and Trade. After a career in the City of London, he was made a life peer in the House of Lords in 2021. Ian Murray is one of only two Labour MPs here and is Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. Before becoming MP for Edinburgh South in 2010, he ran a pizza delivery service, an events company and worked in pensions. And Fraser Nelson was raised in Nairn near Inverness and is editor of the right-leaning magazine The Spectator. In last week's leading article entitled Mafia, he accused the SNP of covering up bad government and of using the pandemic to advance the cause of independence. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here in Glasgow. Great to see you. And, of course, welcome to you watching at home. You can catch up with the programme on iPlayer or on BBC Sounds, whichever way you choose. And, of course, there's always a pretty lively debate going on social media as well. Right, let's take our first question, which is from Alexander Darrick.
Has this week's UK COVID inquiry in Edinburgh exposed a fatal lack of transparency in the Scottish Government?
Kate, well, you were at the COVID inquiry this week, and of course you were in the Scottish Government for a number of years. What's your view?
Well, I have been on the COVID inquiry this week. I gave several hours worth of evidence in front of a judge answering King's Counsel's questions after having given all the evidence that was asked of me, including WhatsApp messages. And I think there's been a lot of deep feeling this week in Scotland, I would say, and I think that's partly because so many of us still bear the scars of COVID. For some, that was a loss of life. For others, it was a loss of livelihood. And for still others, it was a loss of precious moments over those 2.5 years.
And all that, of course, is true. The question is, has this week's COVID inquiry exposed a fatal lack of transparency in the Scottish Government? So you say you handed over your WhatsApps. Nicola Sturgeon says she deleted her WhatsApp because that was government policy. Were you aware that was government policy? Well,
she's obviously given, I think, about 8 hours worth of evidence to the inquiry yesterday. In my own inquiry evidence, I mentioned the fact that policy had been brought to my attention in January 2022, but I'd retained all my messages up to that point.
So you didn't know it was government policy?
I didn't know it was government policy, no. And
so was it actually government policy?
Well, I've obviously answered for what I knew and what I didn't know, and it was in front of a judge that I was answering those questions. But could I just get to the point here, which is the COVID inquiry really matters?
No, hang on. The point is, has it exposed a fatal lack of transparency? What's your answer to that?
Well, I don't believe it has, because I have been open and upfront, and others have answered for it. Do I think there are lessons that have been learned? Absolutely. Do I think that the WhatsApp policy and informal messaging needs to be reviewed? Absolutely. Do I think that everybody should divulge as much evidence as they have as possible? Do I think things should be minuted? Absolutely. And the point of the COVID inquiry, this is why I keep coming back to it, the whole point of the COVID inquiry is that lessons need to be learned lessons will be learned. And I think that if they can get on with the job that they have, it will be for them to conclude and to criticise where it is deserved.
Just one final point. As Finance Secretary, do you think you should have known about and been invited to the Gold Command meeting?
Well, I think that I should have been invited to anything where there was substantial financial matters being discussed. I said that on Tuesday. But I don't think it stopped me from being able to inform the rest of the Cabinet about key financial issues. And I actually think that the COVID inquiry will be able to conclude on those financial matters and see where it had an impact and where it didn't have an impact.
So, Patrick, the question is, has the COVID inquiry exposed a fatal lack of transparency? And Alexander, I'm assuming, actually just enlighten us, I'm assuming you're referring to the fact that the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon deleted her WhatsApps, the Gold Command meetings were not minuted. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, absolutely. Like so many, I was so utterly disappointed in the Scottish Government's conduct. I watched a lot of the inquiry between my hands. It was that bad. I think we had, well, Nicola Sturgeon, I felt, had her Jeremy Paxman moment where the KC took, I think, about 4 or 5 different attempts to distinguish between deletion and being retained. And to me, that stinks of secrecy. Of WhatsApps, yes. That stinks of secrecy, unaccountability. And I thought she looked like a rabbit caught in the headlights. I thought she was found out this week.
Patrick Harvie.
I mean, my direct answer to the question is that I think the inquiry has exposed very serious questions about the retention of data and the processing of data in both governments. And it's also exposed that there wasn't a clear understanding across both governments of what existing policy was. You know, whether that's about WhatsApp messages from a Scottish Government Minister or a UK Government Minister, Alistair Jack confirmed that he deleted all of his WhatsApp messages. The UK Government went to court to say that they shouldn't have to hand over Rishi Sunak's WhatsApp messages. Look, in many ways, I think about this in terms of how technology has affected all of our lives. If this pandemic and the inquiry after it had happened 10 or 15 years earlier, all of that casual, informal conversation that people have would have been verbal. There would have been no written record. And I don't think governments...
There might have been minutes of things like Gold Command meetings, which there were not.
My understanding is there were notes taken of those meetings, but it's a question of whether you call it notes or minutes. But the point I'm trying to make is that governments collectively haven't really adapted to the new world in which that casual, informal conversation turns into a written record. The First Minister has already recognised that there does need to be an independent review of the existing policy, the understanding and the application of that policy. But look, I think I do want to finish just by echoing what Kate said, because this inquiry is about issues of the utmost seriousness. People who lost loved ones, who had their lives turned upside down. That applies to people in this room, it applies to people throughout the country, it applies to people in politics.
That's just that's not what the question is about. The question is about, does it expose a lack of transparency?
Yeah, absolutely. But the issues here need to be addressed by the independent, judge-led inquiries, in fact, because there's a separate Scottish one coming as well, okay, and not turned into a game of political football. I'm afraid I see people on both sides who seem to want to turn this into a gotcha moment to express judgments about politicians they already had a view of, rather than waiting for the independent inquiry to look into this and bring its recommendations.
And as we now learn its government policy, are you deleting your WhatsApp messages?
Well, I've got WhatsApp on my personal phone.
And are you deleting your messages from fellow politicians?
I don't use it for anything to do with government business, other than the most trivial things about, you know, what train am I getting, or is a meeting overrunning, something really, really basic like that. And the Scottish Government, my experience is, does not use WhatsApp for making decisions or even for communicating what those decisions are. They're all done through principally email, and that's all on the government record. That's where it should be, and there are good reasons why government decision-making should not be held on a personal device.
The woman there with a black scarf, I think, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I find the hypocrisy quite breathtaking, actually. You have a former Prime Minister who was heading up a culture of partying, law-breaking, corruption, cronyism and money, and has not submitted a single WhatsApp with the most ridiculous excuses. You've got a current Westminster Prime Minister who also hasn't submitted a single WhatsApp. He can't recall anything. I think it was 30-odd times during this. And I feel that Nicola Sturgeon it's just a witch hunt. I actually think she has stood up for Scotland. I think she did what she could in the most trying situations, and this is absolutely political. I think it's a disgrace.
Okay.
Kate Forbes is she's telling the truth. She's kept her WhatsApps. Mr. Harvie's making excuses. And Nicola Sturgeon has been caught out, and there's no denying that. We're not talking about Westminster government here, we're talking about Holyrood. And you have been caught out. And you shouldn't be making excuses for the SNP.
Fraser.
I think that's exactly it. This isn't a gotcha moment. This is about how Scotland is governed. This is about why there was a culture of secrecy right at the heart of the Scottish Government's approach. And yes, it's certainly true that Nicola Sturgeon promised the COVID bereaved families that she would not delete anything. In fact, she was systematically, routinely deleting these messages. We know that now. But it wasn't just her. Last week we heard from a senior Scottish civil servant who was saying that deleting messages is his pre-bed ritual, a civil servant. Another civil servant saying plausible deniability are my middle names. A civil servant saying that. So what we're seeing here isn't just one woman deleting messages. This is a culture of the way the decisions were made and records were deleted to stop people finding out what was happening after. Now, this is what I can't work out, is beyond scandal after scandal where this is a factor. We've seen, for example, in the great trial of Alex Salmond, he was trying to give a side of the story that was redacted. He wasn't allowed to be, even the Scottish Parliament weren't being able to get to it. And the problem is here is accountability. Devolution was supposed to have the Scottish Parliament holding the Scottish Executive to account. We were supposed to find out, as Scots, more about your government than was being happening in Westminster. And time again, we are seeing really important decisions. I think it was one message from Kate here where she was saying, asking about what was happening, and she was told basically the First Minister and her chief advisor decide that themselves. So the way decisions were being handled, the systematic destruction of the evidence, looked very much like a conspiracy to stop the Scottish public ever finding out what was happening after that. We've seen this time and time again, and the fact that the civil servants were involved suggests this wasn't just politicians messing about, this was a culture of secrecy. And right now, the really important questions that we've got, for example, was there any consideration given about the closure of schools and what that would do? It doesn't seem so. But we're not going to ever find out. Not the UK inquiry, not the Scottish inquiry is going to get to these things because the evidence was conveniently deleted. This is a 25th anniversary of devolution. Scots deserve better then, we deserve better now.
Man in the white shirt.
Interesting that it was this week that the Spectator decided to run their piece, which I call a hit piece on the SNP. And Michael Govaswell, in his own inquiry, he submitted that kind of laying the entire blame of the woeful job the UK government had done on the SNP and Scotland. How does that, enhance the relationship between Scotland and Westminster if this kind of hit job is being done on the SNP?
Well, the McMafia cover story you're talking about was not intended to improve relations between the Spectator and the Scottish National Party. It was basically, this is something you'll find a great many people in Scotland are dismayed that the high hopes we had for devolution have given way to this kind of gangsterism masquerading as government, which is exactly, these are the habits, the covering up, the concealment, and at one point Alex Salmond was saying there was a conspiracy to put him in prison for a crime he didn't commit. You don't get these sort of scandals. This is of a different nature. Now,
and you always set great store by what Alex Salmond says, is that right?
Well, he was a former First Minister of Scotland. I mean, look, I was not the sort of person I would vote for. The role of a journalist is to scrutinise what's happening, and I think there's lots of questions to answer, just about not just so much about SNP behaviour, but about the powers the Scottish Parliament should have to hold people to account. And they're not as great as they should be. I think there should be way more powers of scrutiny. I think it's unbelievable that Scottish civil servants were conspiring to delete these things. So we didn't set out to improve relations with the SNP. We did sort of had to do our duty by our Scottish readers.
Man in the back in the grey top.
Just to address Fraser directly, are we worried that we can probably read Kate's WhatsApps, but are we worried that we missed some party invitations to Holyrood Palace or something? I don't really know what you're trying to look for. I think you've got an extremely short memory about what was happening in Number 10 during
it was a scandal. He resigned, and rightly so.
It took a long time to get there. Other point, though, is why do we have government devices that aren't actually managed properly? If I make a request to an employer for all data on my employment with them, they've got to be able to provide that under data protection laws. Why is that not being covered by Westminster and the Scottish Government? We need full transparency on all devices that are used within government.
Well, we didn't get that from your boss, Alistair Jack, who said only today at the COVID inquiry deleted all his WhatsApps. Unrepentantly. He said I hadn't got the space for them, so I just got rid of them.
Yeah, but he said that we're looking back now, he wished he hadn't done that, and with regret...
It's a bit late, isn't it?
Well, hang on, but except that Nicola Sturgeon said it was government policy.
Well, she also says she regrets it now, but it was too late with her as well.
Because it was government policy.
It was a very similar UK government policy.
So, you know, for me, the thing, the lid was lifted on the inner machinations of the Scottish Government during, you know, a major national pandemic. And, you know, Patrick used the word political football as if it couldn't possibly be some sort of game. And yet we find out, actually, that in the limited minutes that have emerged, that even as the Scottish Government is talking about how to protect the people of Scotland, they're actually also talking about how to relaunch an independence campaign. And using this in a political manner, I think, is really quite shocking, because the COVID came to the UK. UK is one geographical territory. The virus does not respect borders. It doesn't think about Scotland being any different from England. And yet we had a whole series of policies where there was just continual divergence going on between Scotland and England. Which
but it may have been because they had genuinely different views.
But it turns out, and that's what we had been led to believe, it turns out, using their own words, this decision-making was random. It wasn't following the science, it was random. And the other word that was used was that actually the motivation was, Liz Lloyd said, what we really want to do is get a rammy going with the UK government. Which I think is
in one instance
quite an extraordinary... So I think the point here is that divergence, for the sake of divergence, just to find a different way of doing it, is not the right way, I think, to behave in a national pandemic. Don't play politics with people's lives. And I can see how a lot of families would be very angry and upset by what they learned this week.
Yeah, but what you're not saying is that the Scottish Government essentially deleted WhatsApp messages because that was their evidence. Your boss's evidence was taking empty wine bottles out the back of Downing Street to hide the evidence. And the key thing, the question is, have people lost confidence? And Patrick's right. This COVID inquiry is of the utmost importance. But one of the key utmost importance questions it has to answer is, do we have trust in government during one of the biggest health and economic crises this country will ever have met? So you can only learn the lessons if you have the evidence in front of you. Absolutely. And Nicola Sturgeon stood in front of a camera in the daily press conferences that she had, and she said directly to that camera, to the families who were bereaving over lost loved ones, that she would keep all the evidence and all her WhatsApp messages. On the same day, she was deleting them. So that's about the trust in government. We had the National Clinical Director talking about how to give advice to Hamza Yousaf, who was the Health Secretary at the time, and how he didn't have to wear his mask. Liz Lloyd talking about a rammy. These are all things that are coming out on the WhatsApp messages that we do have. What's in the ones that we don't? So if the COVID inquiry is about learning lessons, how are we supposed to learn those lessons without having the evidence in front of us, and why there was no process of recording decision-making absolutely properly? This goes right to the heart of the Scottish Government, right to the heart of trust in politics, and the people that I speak to are really angry that the people like me who were trying to scrutinise, hold government to account, ask questions on behalf of our constituents, people who were losing their livelihoods, losing their relatives, and unable to visit people who were dying in hospital, were saying, you need to ask these questions, and we were completely shut out. And some of the evidence that we've had from these WhatsApps showed that they were trying to shut down opposition, and questions, and the way they talked derogatory about colleagues was a disgrace in some of those WhatsApp messages. So I want to know what the ones that have been deleted said, and we can only learn the lessons when we have all the evidence, and we certainly don't have that. And the only conclusion you can come to is cover up, and both governments should be completely ashamed of themselves.
And can I assume from that you scrupulously keep all of your WhatsApp messages?
Well, I'm not in government, So
No, you're not, but nonetheless, you want to be in government, but also it might be useful. Who knows what will happen? I mean, people cannot predict what's going to happen in the future.
Well,
that's the point of keeping
WhatsApp messages, but I'm not actually under the rules of any government in terms of what WhatsApp messages are. And the only things that are really in my WhatsApp messages of any interest are pretty bad dad banter, I would imagine, not decisions of life and death.
You might want to spare us that.
Looking after people's livelihoods during the worst health and economic crisis in our history.
Woman in the dark top there, yes.
I have lost a lot of trust and faith in politicians, and listening to Kate say that she was part of a cabinet where there was a policy that she didn't even know about, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Kate, do you want to come back in here? And just to remind you, what Alexander's question was has the COVID inquiry exposed a fatal lack of transparency? Is this going to do for the SNP?
Well, I think for the future of our nations, absolutely it cannot be fatal. Because at the end of the day, if there is another pandemic or another emergency, which we dearly hope not, we will need to ensure that there is trust between government, public experts, as well as the public. And, you know, if you go back to the period of the pandemic, trust was high, compliance was high. Why? Because day in, day out, we did see the former First Minister answering questions, responding to issues and explaining her thinking in an open and accountable way.
So what do you think of what Alexander has to say, given what he's heard at the inquiry and Nicola Sturgeon's testimony this week?
Yeah, and I accept, and I did at the beginning, that is precisely why there's such a deep feeling. You know, there's a really deep feeling that we need to resolve. Now, we can resolve that partly through reforming WhatsApp regulations, that matters. But I think what really matters is, I hate to go back to it, the COVID inquiry. It's independent, judge-led. There's a KC leading on it. And I have full confidence that they will get to the bottom of the matter. And it is for them ultimately to conclude, to draw their evidence. They've seen, you know, I was, as you can imagine, preparing for giving evidence, going through every cabinet paper from the last 2.5 years. They've got all that evidence to draw from. And I think their conclusions will matter, because if there is to be any legacy from that loss, any legacy at all, it is to make sure we are never in that situation again.
But Kate, with all
that's
due
why it
respect,
matters.
You might have all the minutes from cabinet meetings, but Gold Command decisions weren't even minuted. Well, the government were making big decisions about life and death and livelihoods and everything else, and nothing was minuted.
There were summary notes. They also have all my WhatsApps, and only a few come from that, because most of them are inane.
And maybe
a bit like Patrick Harvie's ones, but about when a meeting is.
But maybe there's something in there that can connect to other WhatsApp messages that have been deleted. So your transparency is good, but you can't have it on the one hand that there's a government policy to delete, and on the other hand, as you ignored the government policy by having them and didn't delete them, and then criticised people who did delete them. So all of this is just a runaround, where in actual fact, the key thing here is that there was big government decisions made on WhatsApp or otherwise, not minuted. Things have been deleted, and the promise the former First Minister gave to the public was she would keep them all and she would give them all, because that was transparency and trust. And because there's no transparency, that trust has been lost.
Okay.
But Kate, how do you feel about being a senior member of that government? You were effectively number 3 in that. You would take the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, and then the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. And, you know, in any Westminster situation, there's Cobra meetings, all the senior cabinet ministers are there with the officials, all being minuted. These are very serious decisions, life and death decisions in many cases, which have affected particularly our vulnerable groups, the elderly have had a very tough COVID, and our young people had a very tough COVID. These are big decisions. You're a senior member of that cabinet, and you're not even included.
Do you know what my biggest frustration was during COVID? When we couldn't get furlough extended when businesses needed.
Yeah, but answer that question. Kate, answer that question. Kate, answer that question.
I already answered you when you asked it.
Were you frustrated that you were not part of those meetings?
No, I mean, I think I said to the COVID inquiry, I didn't know they existed until towards the pandemic. The point was, as Finance Secretary, could I do my job? And as you know, all the emergency additional funding for the Scottish Government came from the UK Government. So what really mattered was the constructive relationships and engaging with UK government ministers, desperately trying to make
how do you know what funding you need if you're not in the meeting?
Desperately trying to ensure that we had funding for businesses. That's what mattered. And that's what I hope the COVID inquiry draws out. How do we ensure the systems are fit for purpose to avoid us being in this place again?
I suspect this won't be the last time we come to this, because the COVID inquiry is coming back to Scotland. So I suspect this subject will come up again. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to move on for now. And I just want to let you know at home that next week we will be in Nottingham, and we will have the TV star and Question Time superfan making his debut on that programme, Paddy McGuinness. So we'll see what he's got to say. He'll be on the panel. And the week after that, we are in Lancaster. And a list of all our locations, incidentally, until Easter is on the website. So if you'd like to be at Nottingham with our panel and with Paddy McGuinness and in Lancaster, apply to the Question Time website. This is the address, and you can follow the instructions there. And we'd love to see you. Right, let's take a question now from Paddy Kelly. Paddy.
With over 26,000 deaths now in Gaza, when will the UK government ask for a ceasefire?
Now, the UK government has talked about a humanitarian pause, a humanitarian ceasefire, by which it means temporary. When, Paddy's question is, will the UK government call for a ceasefire?
So the Foreign Secretary is very clear that he's talking to Israel and to America, and he wants a ceasefire, talking also to the Palestinians, but it has to be what he calls a lasting ceasefire. And that has to be a situation where both the parties effectively lay down their arms. The fastest way to a ceasefire would be that the hostages are returned to Israel and Hamas lay down their arms and cease to be leading the Palestinians in the Strip. Until that happens, there has to be continual negotiations to bring something about. But at the moment, the Israelis had an atrocity imposed upon them, a massacre of horrific proportions. They feel that they cannot do a ceasefire with people who are firing rockets into their territory. So we're very focused on trying to get a ceasefire, but it has to be a lasting, meaningful ceasefire, and it cannot be unilateral.
And when might that happen? Is there any sense in the negotiations that David Cameron is having as to whether that is even a remote possibility, given that Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is saying there'll be no ceasefire until we get exactly what we want?
Yes. These are it's a very intractable situation. We've got a situation where humanitarian is going in. We've paused with the UN RWA because of the situation we've discovered there in terms of their links with Hamas and being terrorists. So that's difficult, but we're trying to find
by a very small number.
Yeah, by 10%. So we're trying to get aid in through other sources, through Red Cross, etc. And conversations are going on. Britain's been very clear that we want a two-state solution to this. But at the end of the day, Israel as a sovereign state had a terrorist attack impinged upon them, and they need to remove that threat before they can have any sense of a ceasefire.
Patrick.
Israel did experience an atrocity committed against them on October the 7th, and I doubt for one moment that anybody will fail to condemn that atrocity. But since then, Israel has responded by unleashing an atrocity of far greater proportion as mass reprisals against the entire Gaza population. And the tens of thousands of deaths that have been caused, the vast amount of displacement. I mean, the huge majority of that population have been physically displaced, their homes razed to the ground and turned to rubble. It is, of course, absolutely essential that there's a ceasefire. It does need to be multilateral. There does need to be the release of hostages as well. But you can at least call for it. You can at least say that is what must happen. And the idea that we now withdraw the urgently needed humanitarian aid from an organisation that's delivering it, I think that is obscene. What this is at root, though, as well, is a long-standing, generational injustice. And we should not be surprised if the people of Palestine have been told, have been shown, that a peaceful path to statehood will be blocked, We should not be surprised if from among them those who favour a violent path emerge as leaders. If we want them to choose the peaceful path to statehood, we need to make sure that that peaceful path is open to them, and that means recognising the state of Palestine.
Just to echo what Patrick said, I think a ceasefire is crucial, but I also think what is crucial is that the UK government is held to account for their role in licensing arms to Israel at the moment.
I just have to express my view. I have never been more upset and disappointed in our current government with how they have dealt with the situation.
Do you mean the UK government or the Scottish government?
The UK government, apologies. Whether it's the Conservative Party and even the Labour Party, it's an absolute disgrace. How many lives need to be lost? We are between 25 to 30,000 Gazan lives, people who have done nothing wrong. I completely echo what you say. Israel do have a right to defend themselves, absolutely, but at the risk of, not at the risk, the death, murder of 25 to 30,000 people who have done nothing wrong. I can't understand this.
Ian, what's your response to that? Because the leader of the Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, Keir Starmer, has made it quite clear that he does take the government line in terms of a humanitarian pause, but not calling for an outright ceasefire. Is that your view?
I think what's been said is that any country has the right to defend themselves, but it's not a blank cheque. And I think what essentially Israel has been doing is cashing a blank cheque, with nobody able to hold them to account for that. Now, there has been a humanitarian pause that we all hoped and thought that might be the launch pad to something more permanent. But the key question we've all got to ask ourselves is, we all want a ceasefire, but how do you get there? And it seems at the moment that everyone seems pretty powerless to get anywhere towards it. Qatar and Egypt are putting proposals forward as we understand it. There's a new quartet coming together. America's trying to put pressure on. But I just think the whole situation is completely out of control. And
so which Labour leader's line do you support? Is it Keir Starmer's, who's not calling for a ceasefire, or is calling for a pause? Well, or do you support the Labour leader in Scotland's line that there should be an immediate ceasefire?
He's calling for a sustainable ceasefire towards a permanent process to peace.
But the Labour leader in Scotland is calling for an immediate ceasefire. Yes. Which do you support, those two views?
Sarwar said quite clearly, but you have to have the conditions on the ground to deliver it, and that's got to be the key.
So which do you support? Immediate ceasefire? I'm just trying to get clear.
Well, everyone wants to stop this and wants to stop it yesterday. So
that's not in dispute, but you've got Anna Sarwar, the Labour leader in Scotland, saying there should be supporting the SNP's course for an immediate ceasefire. You've got Keir Starmer, who is not taking that line. I'm wondering which line you support.
But the key line that's been taken is that we want to get towards that permanent ceasefire.
Sure, but which of those two views do you support?
Everyone, but they want a ceasefire.
Yes, but they're taking a different approach
to it. It's exactly the same thing. They're saying the same thing.
They're not
but
saying the same thing,
But they need the conditions on the ground to get there. So
I mean, there have been resignations over this. They're not saying the same thing.
Yes, and you know...
So which do you support? I'll give it one more go. Which line do you support?
The line that I support is to try and find the conditions on the ground to get towards a permanent ceasefire.
So that sounds like Keir Starmer.
That's where you've got to get. There is no other option on the ground here. I mean, whether you...
Is it clear to you?
No.
Right,
whether Patrick Harvie is correct or anyone else, you've got to get to the situation where you get that ceasefire. So unless you're talking about a unilateral ceasefire,
UK Labour government
then that's fine.
The state of Palestine.
Yes. And of course, you can't have a two-state solution without having two states. In order to have two states, you've got to recognise one as being a state, and therefore that is indeed correct. You would recognise Palestine as a state.
Let's hear a bit more from us. The man in the blue jacket.
It's a question for Patrick. Patrick, if the shoe was on the other foot and it was your family that was involved in the Israel troubles and Hamas came in and murdered your full entire family, would you not want every single stone unturned to get your hands on these terrorists?
Yes, I think everybody in that situation would want those who are responsible for an atrocity held accountable for an atrocity. What I hope I would never give into is the idea of blaming an entire population, holding them accountable. And what we've seen in recent days is not only that continuing violence. We have seen ministers in the Israeli government dancing and laughing at the idea of driving Palestinians out of Gaza altogether and beginning a programme of Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory. Some of this comes with rhetoric that is nothing less than genocidal, and it needs to be called out.
The sort of tragic thing is, it doesn't, if Britain calls for a ceasefire or not, that won't hold much sway in Israel. What will hold sway is what the United States wants. The United States is there with its aircraft carrier, giving the military support to Israel. So I think Joe Biden is the one who's able to pull the strings here. Now, that's why I was quite encouraged to see that there's reports of just coming out from America now about talks held in Paris last weekend. The Mossad was there, and there seems to be the outlines of an agreement of a ceasefire. It would come in 3 stages. In the first stage, there would be a ceasefire, and then meanwhile Hamas would get the Israeli hostages, get ready to return them back to their families. In stage 2, they would get female Israeli soldiers would be released who are being held captive, and you would get humanitarian aid restored. And phase 3, if it gets to that, would be the more senior prisoner swaps. Now, to me, this sounds like a plan. It sounds like a plausible way out of this détente. And America is the only country, I think, that can really have influence in that region and try to get some kind of settlement. So, look, again, you never know if these things are going to come true or not, but I think the whole world has been sickened, absolutely sickened by the sights that we've seen in the Middle East in the last few weeks. And it could well be that we are about to reach the beginning of the end.
And there in the blue top.
The UK government calls for a ceasefire because we have no influence. It's up to between the Israelis and Hamas to come to an agreement. Hamas are terrorists, they won't come to an agreement. So it won't be a ceasefire until Hamas release all the hostages and give up their arms. So it's not going to happen. But I'm more inclined, why is Patrick Harvie, Kate Forbes, why is the Scottish Government calling for a ceasefire? Foreign policy has nothing to do with Holyrood. Holyrood is a branch of the UK Government. It's supposed to work with it, not against it. And we're seeing with the COVID inquiry, they actually used it as a battering ram. People dying, and they wanted to use it as a battering ram against the UK Government because they wanted their army. Holyrood should be shut down. It's time for it to be wiped out place. It was a bad experiment. It was a good idea at the time. Close it down. Time for it to go.
I might let the rest of the audience answer that one because I think that was quite clear. But can we get to the serious, very serious issue? Because I think we could accept, can we not, that even when you don't necessarily hold the power to do something, you at least need to recognise what's right and wrong in what you say. And I think when it comes to the Middle East, let's remember who's paying the price here. It's women and girls. In a war, women and girls pay the price. From the 7th of October and the atrocities committed against Israelis, but look at the atrocities committed against women. And in Gaza, 13,000 children killed. And tens of thousands more probably left orphaned, isolated, separated from their families. So that is the most weighty imperative to bring this to a conclusion. But the conclusion must ensure that there is safety and freedom for civilians, that these atrocities will never be committed again, that hostages will be released, and that Palestinian people who have no part to play in terrorism, no part to play in it, can live freely. So I agree with the sentiment in the question and wish those that are negotiating and committed to negotiating the best in order to bring this to a swift conclusion.
But you also need both sides to act in good faith. And I think some of the examples that Patrick have given about the way that some Israeli politicians have acted, and then on the other side a terrorist organisation, that just shows you how difficult it is to bring this together. And do we have both parties in this who are being brought to the table acting in good faith? And I think that's a big question mark of whether or not they are.
We will also return to this question without doubt. I'm going to move on now to Duncan MacDonald.
Yes.
Let's hear from you.
In light of the black hole in public finances, should things like free prescriptions and free travel for young people be scrapped?
Patrick?
No, I certainly wouldn't scrap those policies that invest in the people of Scotland. Something like free bus travel for young people I've spoken to young people who have been able to take a college course, which they would simply not have been able to afford to do because they've got access to that free bus pass. I've spoken to young people who've been able to take a job in somewhere that's a little bit further away from home, a job that they wouldn't have been able to take if it hadn't been for that ability to travel. And it's also about setting the expectation that public transport is a norm, is a default expectation for a whole new cohort of people. And we need to change the way we travel if we're going to have a hope of addressing the climate emergency. It also, that policy also helps to make bus routes viable. In many parts of the country, bus routes have been under immense pressure, and this is a policy which helps make those viable. Look, universal services are an important part of how we invest collectively in the well-being of our population. If you take the opposite view and you think everything should be means-tested, you would end up without an NHS. You would end up without schools that are free for people to use, and they'd be charged for based on the income of their parents. The way to pay for collective provision of public services that make us all better off collectively is through progressive taxation. And by having more progressive taxation in Scotland, there's an extra £1.5 billion in the Scottish budget every year to invest in public services. It's not enough because we need the financial levers that independence would give us in order to make the big macroeconomic choices that would allow us to invest on the scale that the UK has been consistently failing to do. But what we've managed to do in Scotland with the powers of devolution is some greater redistribution, closing the gap between the richest and the rest, invest in public services, things like the Scottish Child Payment, which viewers down south may not be aware of. We're investing in young people, lifting many, many thousands of young people out of poverty. While the UK government is trying to cut taxes for the richest, we are trying to cut poverty in Scotland. And that's the direction of travel that's been successful in Scotland. We should recommit to it rather than rolling back on it.
Fraser.
I think the premise of the question was, given the perilous state of the public finances, can we really afford all this? Scotland is now the most heavily taxed part of the United Kingdom.
For high earners.
Well, it is, and there's so much money being spent basically subsidising the middle class and the rich. And this is what I can't work out. Why should it be that somebody who can afford private school fees then pays no tuition at all in Scotland? Why subsidise the rich in that way? Some people can afford to pay, why shouldn't they? When you look at the public opinion, Scots think, quite right too, that they don't see why, if a family can afford the university tuition fees, why shouldn't they pay that fee? Why shouldn't they pay 9,000, perhaps even more, if they can afford it, if they paid 15, 20 grand for private schools? It doesn't make sense to go on subsidising the rich, which will not only increase the tax burden, it squeezes the provision for everybody else. So I'm afraid to say that this public spending in Scotland is so big. The deficit now in Scotland is the biggest deficit in the Western world in terms of a gap between what government spends and what government raises in tax. Now, that's one of the big problems for an independent Scotland, because you'd have to close that gap somehow. But the spendthrift nature of the Scottish governments over the years, basically, if you see it, spend money in it, and it doesn't really matter if you're subsidising the rich because it's all one big jolly, I think that will end up bankrupting an independent Scotland. Well, I don't think one will come, right, to be honest, the way things are going with the COVID inquiry. But I don't think that right now public spending in Scotland is being spent as wisely as it could to the policies that you're describing there.
Man there in the green top.
Obviously, I'm a wee bit biased because I'm under 22, but I think stuff like free bus travel is the sort of thing I think is a step in the right direction. It affects... It allows me... It gives me a lot of... I get to uni with my bus. It saves me a lot of money, and I think it's just exactly the sort of thing the government should be doing, helping folk.
And
basically.
Fraser's point about if you can afford it, you should pay, and if you can't, you should get it free.
Well, that's progressive tax, but I think we should be taxing the rich more. If they can afford it, then
okay.
No.
Okay, and the woman in the pink jacket, a little bit further along.
Well, I don't think the youngsters should be having free travel. When I was young, we never got it, and it was my parents that had to get me around the country. And basically, we do pay the most tax in the UK, which is a disgrace. There's 3 levels of tax in Scotland. 20,000 earners, they pay 21% tax. 43, if you earn 43,662, you have to pay 42% tax, and 75 and above pay 45% tax, which I think is ridiculous.
And there's another tax now as well.
There is another tax. We've got several levels of tax.
Let her speak, though.
We have several levels of tax, and I also agree that we shouldn't be having free prescriptions. We should contribute to our prescriptions. England, for people on life-saving drugs, they get all their drugs, but they pay £90 a year, which is nothing to have life-saving drugs. Our NHS is on its knees. Our public services are all on their knees. We've got a Police Scotland now. All our police offices are getting closed. Where people go for to a safe place these days, you can't even call the police now. Nobody turns up. Our services are on its knees, and Scotland needs to wake up to that, because you can't keep taxing average people. My son's an average earner, and he will soon be hitting a very high tax bracket.
No.
For a young man and a young family, it's not fair.
Okay.
And Scotland cannot keep taxing and taxing and taxing to pay for free bus travel for children. Another thing,
Okay, I might have to bring the panel
the
in.
bus drivers are complaining because they're wrecking the buses and they're getting around the city and being disruptive.
Just on a
So, can I just bring, given that Kate was Finance Secretary when a lot of this was going on, what's your response to that?
Well, my response is that the public finances need to be resolved by considering the root cause and not penalising people who are not part of the problem. And at the end of the day, why are we facing challenging finances? Well, because our economy is stagnating, because we've had some of the most stubborn inflation rates in the G7, and ultimately because of Tory mismanagement of our economy. Does anyone remember Liz Truss? So we're still dealing with the consequences of an economy that is not growing as fast as it should be.
Sure, but Duncan's question is about choices, Kate.
Indeed.
You know, choosing to give things like free prescriptions, free travel. You're objecting to that. What's your name, sorry, in the pink jacket? Leanne. Leanne is objecting and saying you don't feel you're getting what you're paying for in your taxes generally. Yeah, and a lot of this was going when you were Finance Secretary.
My point is that even if you remove that from people, you're not going to solve the root problem. And you need to get to the substance of the problem, which is a mixture of trying to get our economy firing on more cylinders, attracting more people to Scotland, ensuring that we don't face that demographic challenge. And instead of, as it were, talking about higher rates of taxation, what we should be doing is talking about more people living and working in Scotland. So I think talking about prescription charges, yes, you could have a debate about that. I'm fully committed to free prescription charges. I think that introducing free bus travel for under 22s is one of the most effective policies that we've introduced. And I think ultimately the question for Scotland is how do we ensure that we're not in this situation again? Now, we know that there might be an election at the end of this year, and last time I heard, Labour were saying they're not going to do anything differently from the Tories when it comes to turning spending caps on.
We'll question Labour.
That's the fundamental question, I think, here in Scotland.
While we've got you, though, you have talked about the Greens, you're the fellow Greens in the SNP, saying the Greens appear to want to over-regulate communities out of existence and hike taxes. So presumably you think they're doing the wrong thing.
Well, the funny thing is that it was a cooperation between Patrick Harvie's government, Patrick Harvie's party, and when I was Finance Secretary that introduced free bus travel.
Yes, but you've criticised them for hiking taxes.
Well, I've just set out my point there, which is, I think, the
he's just
more
sitting
effective.
here. So do you want to ask him to reduce taxes?
I'm in, the party, the SNP in government, but my point is that the fastest way to expand public revenue is attracting more people to live and work in Scotland. And we all know that there's a fine balance when it comes to tax, but we wouldn't have a discussion about tax if our economy was thriving. We wouldn't be having the discussion about tax if our population was growing. So that's my point. Make sure you're not dealing with the wrong symptoms. Go to the root cause instead.
But the highest tax rate in the UK doesn't exactly say come to Scotland, does it?
Well, I think
which is 48% for those who aren't
When
aware.
it comes to the choices that the Scottish Government is facing right now, we got obviously a Barnett consequential. Government departments in England are being expected to find £19 billion of cuts over the next few years. That has an impact on our budget. And so, again, I go back to this point. It's a growing economy that we need rather than taking things off people.
Ian, do you want to answer Kate's point about... Well, would you change any of this? Would, for example, the 48% tax, which has just come in, would you change that?
I'm quite astonished that, as the former Finance Secretary, complaining that there's not enough growth in the economy, when Scotland's economy is lagged behind even the bad growth in the UK economy. The economy in Scotland stagnated now for far too long, and the danger is that with all these things like free bus passes and free tuition, I agree with them and they're great things to have, but the danger is in Scotland you're going to end up in a situation with a free bus pass without a bus, free tuition without a course, 1 in 6 people on NHS waiting list, the education system falling apart. There is no defensible record that the Scottish Government have over the last 16 years that they're currently able to defend in terms of public services.
So would you change any of that? Would you change in that, Ian? That's the point.
You've got to find growth in the economy. You've got to grow your way out of it.
So would you scrap any of these things that people are getting?
You cannot tax your way to growth. And
such as tuition, prescription, bus passes?
Let me give you an example. The UK is currently in the highest tax burden on working people in 70 years. And the tax burden has gone up 25 times. It is now the highest taxing UK Parliament in the history of Parliaments, in the history of UK Parliaments. You can't just keep taking more and more money out of people's pockets and expect the economy to grow.
Let's answer Duncan's question very specifically.
To give you the money to invest in public
Duncan's question is, should things like free prescriptions and free travel for young people be scrapped? Should they?
I don't think it should be scrapped, but you have to grow your economy to enable you to be able to pay for them, and you can't have a free bus without a bus, a free bus pass without a bus.
Malcolm, should they be scrapped?
Well,
that's not what's happening south of the border, so should they be scrapped here?
I have to congratulate Kate. You didn't let me down there. When you ever asked the Scottish Government about the finances, you just blame Westminster.
But it is your fault. You crashed the economy.
Just blame Westminster.
Give the SNP the excuse because you keep crashing the economy.
So the reality is that Scotland, as well, is probably the best funded part of the United Kingdom. Right. For every £100 spent in England by the UK spends £125 in Scotland. Okay, Fraser's right. We run a deficit in Scotland, which is 12%. To get into the EU, the much vaunted plan to get into the EU, you need to have a maximum deficit of 3%. It's currently 12%. So Scotland's basically earning £75 a day and spending £100 a day. Okay, so we've got a situation where that Scotland is well funded to the United Kingdom, and the best place for Scotland to get back on its feet is within the United Kingdom. Now, the public finances in the UK. Does anyone remember COVID? We spent 400 million on COVID. We spent 400 billion, and 100 billion on the cost of living in the last 5 years. Our debt has gone to record levels. And the interest on that debt has gone from 40 billion to 120 billion. We spend 100 on education, 50 on defence, 200 on health. We used to spend 40 on our interest payments, our credit card. It's now 120.
Because
so you can understand, therefore, that whichever government was in, we had to get through COVID. Our public finances are now high. We have to bring it down. Now, the thing about devolution, and the great thing about devolution, is that the Scottish Government is empowered to make its own decisions about how it spends its money. And the priorities of the Scottish Government have been...
raising 90,000 children out of poverty.
The priorities have been in welfare, in public sector wages, and the 3 lowest spending departments have been education, the police and local councils. The reality is it's up to the Scottish Government to spend their money. They must take the consequences, therefore, and they have to decide what's free and what's not free. Everyone loves things to be free, but at the end of the day, you've got to pay for it. Now, the last point on tax is that Patrick's very proud of his progressive tax. However... if you look at the numbers now...
You'll be paying a bit more.
If you look at the numbers now, 12% of the population, the working population in the UK is paying 65% of the tax. 2/3 of the tax from 12%. That is not sustainable.
Just on that is
not sustainable.
Hang on.
It's not a sustainable economic model. So therefore, by putting tax up to such a high level, you're disincentivising your highest earners to contribute to the coffers. You need to bringing in a growth economy into Scotland, the welfare economy run at Scotland, as Ian has said.
But what about answering Duncan's question? I'm going to be old-fashioned about this, but let's try and get an answer to that, because that was very specific. Should things like free prescriptions and free travel for young people be scrapped? Yes or no?
And the answer to that is it's up to the Scottish Government to make that decision from their record budget.
What's your view? I appreciate devolution. Do you have a view, or do you just not have a view?
It's not free in England, as the lady in
on
the
a very brief factual point
said.
When we shifted from the UK's 3-band income tax system to a 5-band, in my view, more progressive system with high-income earners paying more, the tipping point was the average full-time salary. If you were earning an average full-time salary, you paid not a penny more. If you were earning less than that, you paid a bit less. If you were earning more, you paid a little bit more. It's only those earning very high that pay significantly more.
Let's hear what the
UK government
audience
was
think about
cutting
it.
Income tax for the highest earners.
Well, let's ask the people who are paying these taxes
bonuses,
and whether they
now they want to scrap the public services.
Ian, I'm so sorry, but let's hear a little bit from the audience, because after all, these are the people who are getting. When I say free services, obviously you're paying for it through taxation. So strictly speaking, of course, it's not free. But in the south of the border, you pay additionally. So the man there in the check shirt with the glasses. Yeah.
Right. I've moved up a band, so I'm paying a lot more tax, but I'm quite happy to do that to help children come out of poverty.
Well,
and I think it's a good decision for Scotland government.
And the woman here in the front.
I just think it's very different for me hearing this, as I'm type 1 diabetic. I've been since I was 9 years old, and I'm very proud to come from Scotland and live here because of the policies that were in place. I mean, I came from a working class family. Without these policies in place, it's really supported me, and it's quite frightening hearing that so many people condemn them and say that they're not worth it when it's really helped me in my life. And people in America, for instance, are paying hundreds of dollars for insulin, and I can get it for free here, which I really appreciate.
Okay. Yes, in the red shirt.
Thanks. I think the thing is, you kind of need to decide whether you're going to have high tax and high services or lower tax and less services. And over decades, you've all sold us a lie that we can have low taxes and high services, and that's why we're in debt.
So what would you like to see happen?
God knows, I think it's all an absolute state. Honestly, if I had the answers to that, I'd be sat there, and I don't.
But you've currently got high taxes and poor services. You're not even getting it either side.
But that's the point, because over years, your party, not yours, you're not a politician, sorry, mate. You've all...
We all know which one he supports.
Continuously spent more than is brought in from tax. So then, over time, we're having to pay interest on that debt. So we have less money to spend, and it goes on and on and on. And so where's the way out of it? And that's the reason that the services are rubbish, but there's still high taxes. Because we're trying to cover what's happened in the past, because you've all lied to us for so long.
All right, we haven't got much time left. Yes, the man just in front of you, yeah, with the glasses, yes.
So I want to say, so coming from an outside perspective, not being a Scottish student, in Wales, we do get free prescriptions. We do not get free bus passes. That is something that Scotland's only. But I can assure you the facilities that we have in Wales are just as poor as that found in Scotland. So by cutting free bus passes, we are not making it any better. By allowing me to have a free bus pass, I can get to uni on time and in an efficient manner. Without that, I wouldn't be able to have the education I am receiving at the moment.
So it's working for you?
Yes.
All right. I've got about 30 seconds left. The woman at the back in the white top.
Yeah. Could I go first to the free passes? Basically, in principle, I would agree. We need public transport to go green. That's for sure. But the big problem, you're giving it to young people, but we have an obesity crisis because young people don't walk the way people had to walk years ago. So you're actually encouraging the obesity in younger people. But the second point is...
Oh, you have to be quick. I'm so sorry, because we're almost out of time. Very quickly.
There might be somebody of 40 that you're actually disincentivising because she can't afford the bus fares to take the job because she's only allowed $12,700 a year before she starts paying tax.
OK, thank you for your point.
So your progressive tax system isn't working.
OK, we hear you. I'm so sorry to rush. It's just we're out of time. Forgive me. Our hour is up. I'll have to be quick because we're already out of time. But I just want to say thank you to Paul Farrell for providing us with the lovely pictures of Glasgow. Thank you very much to you. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to our audience here. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching. Until next week from Question Time. Bye-bye.